Good morning, or I guess it's good afternoon, everyone. Tony Weiler, your executive director. I wanted to just hop on today and say hello and introduce our speaker today. We're happy to have Dr. Gleb Tsipursky talk about the science of justifying emotional distress compensation. Dr. Tsipursky leverages his expertise in behavioral science and decision making to help lawyers persuade the trier of fact to adopt their case theory. He is well versed in the Dalbert standard, and Dr. Gleb has written 7 best-selling books. His cutting-edge thought leadership has been featured in over 650 articles and 550 interviews in prominent venues. Dr. Gleb spent over 15 years in academia as a behavioral scientist. That's harder for me to say than Dalbert. With 8 years as a lecturer at UNC Chapel Hill and 7 years as a professor at Ohio State. He earned his PhD at UNC Chapel Hill, his MA at Harvard, and his BA at NYU in 2002. He's a proud Ukrainian American. He lives in Columbus, Ohio. So, Dr. Tsipursky, we're glad to have you here with us today and look forward to your presentation. And I guess if anyone has questions, they could put them in the chat. Is that what you'd prefer?
That's right. Yeah, that's what I prefer.
Okay. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the introduction, Tony. And welcome, everyone. So, let's talk about the science of justifying emotional distress compensation. This is based on an article about this topic that the North Dakota Bar Journal has published. So, this will be available as a resource after the event. Now, if you're watching this as a recording after the event, in order to get the resources from this training, the article, the slides, a copy of my book on this topic, you should go to the link under my name, which is tinyurl.com/DAE event. Again, tinyurl.com/DAE event. And you'll get the links, you'll get the resources from the presentation. So just so you know. Okay. Now, you should be able to see me clearly, and my slides will be next to me on the screen. This is the way that they'll be changing right next to me on the screen, just taking care of housekeeping and logistics. If you don't see the slides fully, what you should do is change your mode of view into speaker mode. So make sure to change your view into speaker mode so that you could see it fully and make it full screen. That way, you'll be able to see the slides on my screen. All right. So hopefully that's pretty clear. And of course, keep your microphones muted during the presentation. And we do have a large audience crowd. I will allow, at certain points, we will have breakout groups so you can discuss the content. And then you'll have your microphones on and you'll discuss the content with your fellow attendees. So, but in the meantime, please have your microphones off. And if you have any questions at any time, put them into the chat. I'll be happy to talk through and answer questions throughout the presentation if they are appropriate for me to get to throughout the presentation. If there are larger questions or if I'm going to answer them later in the presentation, I'll get to them later. Okay, so hopefully that should be good housekeeping. If you have any questions, put them into the chat about the housekeeping. So let's talk about what we'll be covering. First, understanding mental anguish and emotional distress. Now, non-economic damages is the focus of this presentation. So how do you address non-economic damages? How do you pursue them as a plaintiff? How do you defend against them as a defendant? We'll talk about both aspects of things. Non-economic damages, they're more obvious in physical form. So I'm going to be talking a little bit more about mental anguish and emotional distress. But of course, physical form, non-economic damages, this all applies to physical non-economic damages as well. So this applies to everything. So right now, for example, I'm involved as I'm involved as an expert witness in helping defend the city of Annapolis against a $130 million class action lawsuit around public housing. I'll get into the minutia of that later. as I share an expert witness report about that case. But the case is, it's a lawsuit on behalf of the 1,600 residents of the public housing in the city of Annapolis. And the accusation, the claim is that the city of Annapolis has not done appropriate inspections on the housing in the public housing there. And so as a result, there's some mold and other issues, but the mold has been linked to asthma. And so asthma is, of course, the physical non-economic damage, right? So it's a physical damage, it's non-economic damage, and it's hard to evaluate. And there is definitely research on how you evaluate it. And so asthma can be quantified, and we can talk about how much it should be quantified. But that's physical, non-economic damage. And there's a little bit more clarity around that topic than about mental anguish and emotional distress. So we're focusing more on mental anguish and emotional distress, and that plays a role in, and I'll be talking about a case and sharing with you an expert witness report that's relevant to that as well. So that will be an example of a lawsuit in Texas where someone was discriminated against, and I'm representing the plaintiff. I'm the expert witness for the plaintiff. I was the expert witness for the plaintiff. That case is over. And in that case, the plaintiff experienced mental anguish and emotional distress, and that was part of the lawsuit because she was discriminated against by her HOA. And so I'll be talking about that as well. So that's an example of mental anguish and emotional distress, and how do you evaluate it and how do you put a number on it. So understanding mental anguish and emotional distress, then challenges in subjective evaluation, which of course apply to mental anguish, to emotional distress, to physical challenges like asthma. So for example, in the lawsuit, the people suing the city are asking for 75,000 in damages for issues like people developing asthma as a result of mold. Is that a correct number? Is that a fair number? Is that appropriate? Is that too high, too low? We'll see. There's research on this topic, and so you can more fairly and effectively evaluate it if you look at the research. Introduction of the QALY metric in legal evaluations. So this is going to be the quality of life years metric. That is a really good strategy that passes the Daubert standard on evaluating non-economic damages, whether it's mental anguish and emotional distress, whether it's physical damages, so if it's medical malpractice, you can also use it for medical malpractice, all sorts of things. Some real-world examples. So I'll give you two finished cases, two cases that were done, and two cases that are still ongoing. And I'll go into those. Well, the case with that I mentioned in Texas, the first, I mean, they're appealing it, but the defendant won, not the defendant, the plaintiff won, and the defendant is appealing. So it's not finished yet. So I'll go into those cases in more detail. They're fresh on my mind. I just had the expert witness, the depositions, and so on. Then talk about strategies for presenting QALY in court. How do you present this metric in court effectively? And the benefits of using QALY for lawyers. What are the benefits for you in using this metric? And as you know, this is a 1.5 CLE. So this is going to be, we're going to be finishing up in an hour and 20 minutes from now, just so you can calibrate your timing. All right. Part one, understanding mental anguish and emotional distress. Emotional distress, let's talk about what that means. Intense sadness. So sadness, that is an important component of emotional distress. Grief is a form of sadness, but a particular form of sadness that comes with major loss. So you can have intense sadness without grief, but grief will always be a part. Intense sadness will always be a part of grief, or grief is one form of intense sadness. Anger, that's different from sadness. That's feelings of that the world is unjust, anxiety, fears about the world. Panic attacks are physical manifestations of this emotional distress. Then cognitive. So here's where we get into the mental elements of things. You have negative thoughts, which are definitely unpleasant and challenging for people. Rumination, repeating cycles of these negative thoughts, where it's not simply different negative thoughts, but it's the same negative thought repeating over and over again, or a series of these negative thoughts. And difficulty concentrating, so difficulty focusing. What physical components come with this mental anguish and emotional distress? We see headaches pretty often. We see muscle tension. Sleep disturbances are quite frequent with these dynamics. Fatigue is quite common. The GI issues, gastrointestinal issues are pretty frequent, and hair loss. So those are going to be things that doctors can testify to observing in a way that they can't testify to observing what's going on in the patient's head, because the patient says what's going on in their head. But there are certain things that doctors can observe and that they can provide in medical reports. And that's something that is going to be useful for the jury because those are things you can observe and discuss. So juries appreciate seeing things, not just saying that the person who is the plaintiff saying that they're very sad and they're grieving, but these physical manifestations are valuable for convincing the jury that that is indeed the case and convincing them of the extent of these feelings. Impact on life. So what's the impact of mental anguish and emotional distress on life, personal life? It causes strained relationships, which of course relationships are the stuff of life. And so that's a big problem. Social withdrawal, where people withdraw socially, and not with all of these dynamics. So for example, anger frequently causes strained relationships, whereas anxiety can cause social withdrawal. Professional life, there's decreased job performance. So people are underperforming, increased absenteeism. So again, when they're in a job, when they are there, they're underperforming. They can't focus, can't concentrate, and they much more often miss work. Overall quality of life, reduced pleasure and satisfaction, which is definitely damaging. I mean, this is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Reduced happiness, pleasure, and satisfaction. And there's a risk of major conditions like major depressive disorder or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, right now I'm involved in one case where a veteran, an expert witness on a case where a veteran who had PTSD for quite a while and he was getting better. He went to a casino and hotel casino complex and he went to the sauna there. So he was taking a sauna, but the door was closed and then somehow it locked and it wouldn't open. And his fiance was on the outside. She tried to open. He tried to open from the inside. He couldn't. The fiance was on the outside. She couldn't open it. So something malfunctioned. And he, in the steam room, just because it was steamy and he was in there for much longer than he should have been, he lost consciousness and he fell, hit his head, and the actual physical damage was not that bad. But the problem was that he went to the hospital after they got some technicians to jam up on the door, got them out. He went to the hospital, and over time, he gradually relapsed on his PTSD symptoms. And so that was a big problem, of course, because he was worked for a long time on getting to a good state on his PTSD symptoms. And so the PTSD symptoms, I'm working for the plaintiffs there and talking about what is the monetary value of the person backtracking on his PTSD symptoms over this time and how much worse they got. And how do you evaluate that? How do you put a monetary value on those symptoms? Okay, so let's talk about part two. So we talked about understanding mental and emotional anguish. By the way, if you have any questions in part one on understanding mental and emotional anguish, please put them into the chat. I'll be happy to answer them. Okay. Let's go on to issues with traditional subjective evaluation methods. So there's a lack of standardization. This is a serious problem. There's no scientific basis for these methods, and so there's a lack of standardization, and that's a serious, serious challenge for folks, for the trier of the case, whether it's the judge, the jury. So there's no standardization, and of course, the trier of the case wants to see a standardized methodology. There's no scientific basis for much of what we're talking about here. So that is a problem, that if there's no scientific basis for evaluation with traditional subjective evaluation methods, where they're just kind of pulling, let's say, with a case, the 130 million case for the city of Annapolis, where they're just pulling $75,000 out of the air, right? They're like, well, what should we evaluate? Let's say 75,000. No scientific basis for that metric. They're not pretending to have scientific basis. They're just saying, well, we think it should be 75,000 per person. Inconsistent criteria for assessing distress. So this is a major problem where we don't have consistent criteria for assessing distress, a serious, serious issue. There's variability in tools and scales that are used. So different tools and different scales are used, and that's very unfortunate because that variability undermines the ability to have a good argument and to say that they're standardized. It's because you have variable tools, variable scales that aren't research-based, and that honestly are picked in order to maximize certain values and really not used in a research-based scientific way. It's hard to pass the Daubert standard in that case. They're dependent on the rhetorical skills of the lawyer to convince the judge or the jury, whoever is trying the case. That's a challenge because you're not getting down to the actual law. You're not getting down to what's fair. You're not getting down to what's accurate. You're getting down to who has better rhetorical skills. And well, that's very important to have good rhetorical skills. That should not be the determinant of justice in the US. That demonstrates the need for more objective and reliable methods. So, another thing that we need to understand, there's variability in individual experiences. So personal differences. People can have different emotional responses to similar events. There can be the influence of personal history and context. And so that causes variability. That, as again, reduces standardization. You really want to focus on being standardized and giving the same awards to people for the same events happening to them. There's cultural factors where there's cultural variations in how people express distress, different coping mechanisms and different support systems. That shows the need for a more scientific, standardized approach where we can honestly and accurately say that, hey, this type of mental distress, emotional distress, or this type of physical distress should cause this type of compensation. Okay, let's talk about some specific errors that are made in evaluating, in subjective evaluations. One is called the confirmation bias. And this is a type of cognitive bias. So if you've heard of the term cognitive biases are the way that our mind is miswired. It's why we make mistakes in evaluating reality, in evaluating the facts, and evaluating what's happening, in any given situation. Judges, juries, lawyers, that's definitely a problem for when they fall into cognitive biases. Confirmation bias is one of the biggest and most common cognitive biases. If you've heard of cognitive biases, confirmation bias, you've probably heard of this one. It refers to seeking information that confirms what we already believes and ignoring information that conflicts with our predispositions. Now, that causes skewed evaluations based on initial impressions and reinforces existing beliefs, which is obviously bad if you want to figure out the truth and the facts. So, for example, a clinician can focus on symptoms that fit a diagnosis and overlook alternative explanations. And so that would definitely cause a clinician to make a mistake. So that is a frequent way that clinicians can make mistakes. When they make mistakes, that's a frequent way that they make mistakes, to be clear. So confirmation bias is definitely a problem with subjective evaluations. Another problem is called the anchoring bias. That refers to over-reliance on initial information. So whatever we hear initially, we tend to overly rely on it. We use first impressions as a reference point. The impact is that it causes distorted assessments due to the initial data that we got, and we have difficulty adjusting the evaluations to new information. So that is a serious challenge, the anchoring bias. For example, initial symptom report can influence the overall judgment, and clinicians, I'm just using the example of clinicians, nothing against them, but to use a consistent example, they can fail to adequately consider subsequent evidence and again make mistakes that then result in serious problems for the patient. Availability heuristic. We overestimate the importance of readily available information in our memory by relying on recent or memorable events. So we tend to bias toward dramatic cases or recent cases, and we neglect less obvious but quite relevant information. So, for example, if a clinician sees a case that he or she thinks was similar to this one recently, they tend to overemphasize on the case, especially its vivid case from a patient. Another subjective evaluation that's a problem is called the fundamental attribution error. So fundamental attribution error, we must attribute causes of behaviors or symptoms to internal factors rather than the external situation, rather than what's going on externally. As a result, we incorrectly blame individuals for their distress and we overlook situational factors. For example, we can attribute distress to personal weakness and ignore external stressors like discrimination. So that's an example of a fundamental attribution error. Not a clinician in this case, just trying to use a different example. How do you mitigate these cognitive biases? You need to be aware of them, recognize their presence. So you need to have training to identify and counteract these biases. Getting part of this is your training you're getting right now to recognize and counteract these biases. You need to stay updated with the recent research on biases and implement best practices in evaluations. Standardized tools include using validated and objective metrics like the quality of life year and ensuring consistency in evaluations. And this is why we really need objective measures, scientific approaches that incorporate quantitative metrics, not yes or no, not a binary, but a quantitative metric, one that gives a range and one that gives specific numbers to ensure reliability across varied cases. The legal implications is that doing so will help you meet the Daubert standard and enhance your credibility in court, which is great. So, are there any questions so far on the subjective evaluations and the challenges with them and some of the mistakes we make with them? And if you have questions, again, pop them into the chat. Okay, if no questions so far, let's talk about the QALY metric. Stands for Quality Adjusted Life Year. Quality Adjusted Life Year. It combines quantity and quality into one single measure. So here's how you calculate it. One QALY is 1 year of life in perfect health adjusted for age and demographic. So obviously a year of perfect health for someone who's 20 will be different than a year of perfect health for someone who's 70, but adjusted for the person's demographics. 0.5 QALY is 1 year of life at 50% quality. So for example, it's the typical evaluation for blindness is that it takes away about 50% of your quality of life. And so someone who is 20 and is otherwise healthy but blind will have half of the quality of life of someone who's 20 and perfectly healthy and not blind. The same thing for somebody who's 70 and perfectly healthy and not blind versus somebody who's 70 and blind and otherwise healthy. So that's an example of how you evaluate QALY and a quick comparison of the various impact of something like blindness, which is much more obvious. So if somebody is struck blind, the jury will be much more obviously it will be much more obvious to the jury to evaluate the impact of that, although definitely better to use quality. But of course, mental anguish and emotional distress and things that are less obvious, like let's say chronic pain or asthma, that's much harder to evaluate for a jury. And so you really need to have much more clear metrics for that. The components of quality. You have the length of life, how long somebody is living. So years lived, basically. You can have full year, you can have half a year, you can have whatever, however many years. Longevity is highlighted, so how long somebody lives. And then the quality of life, using health-related quality of life measures. How good is somebody's health? Factors influencing quality of life are people's physical, mental, and social well-being. So those three dynamics influence quality of life. So formula for quality adjusted life year, combines both. It's length of life times quality of life. Now, where does quality come from? What is the origin of quality? It was developed in the 1960s by health economists. What was the initial purpose? The goal was to assess the value of medical interventions. That was the point, the purpose. It's like, okay, if we have this medical intervention that addresses asthma, and this medical intervention that addresses blindness, and let's say they cost the same, where should we spend our resources? Should we spend our resources on addressing asthma, or should we spend our resources on addressing blindness? And so, and even if they cost different amounts, let's say one costs 2 times as much as the other, maybe asthma is twice as worse as blindness, or maybe blindness is worse, twice as bad as asthma, or maybe more. So we need to compare various medical interventions. That's what's the origin of this. And it was adopted by public health experts and also health economists. And it's now very widely used for policymaking for resource allocation of all sorts. So let's talk about the standard quality evaluations. So standard quality value. Let's talk about what that is. I'll be using the number of 125,000 per quality in the US. So let me tell you about how I got to this number. The basis for evaluation, this is a little bit lower than a quality is valued right now in the US. I'm using 2020 numbers for ease of math. The typical life valued was about 10 million by the US government. And that was in around 2020 or so, a little bit before 2020. I'm using this number because it's easy to do math, and I'm just using it for simplicity, so we can clearly see the numbers. Average US life expectancy of about 80 years. So the calculation is that it's 10 million divided by 80 years is 125,000 qualities. So this is the current quality. So this was quality in something like the end of the teens. Let me share with you where you can get the current numbers. So you should all be able to see my screen. And I'll put this into the chat for your reference. This is the US Department of Transportation, so it doesn't get much more official than that. And the Health and Human Services will have the same sort of information. You could see the quality adjusted life year adjusted for inflation over the years. So it was something like 9.1 million in 2012, gradually rose with inflation. And this, I'm using the number that's, yeah, end of the teens, something like around 2016, 2017 numbers. But now, due to the higher inflation recently, this is the latest number. So it's 13.2 million. So the actual quality evaluated right now is something like $167,000 versus $125,000. But I'm using the $125,000 just for ease of math. Okay, so let's talk about and get deeper into how you would use quality in a courtroom. Let's talk about specifically depression. how would you look at quality loss due to depressive symptoms? So here's a study, and I'll send you the link to the slide so that you'll have all the information you need. And you can take a look at that study. You can pull it up and read about it yourself. But it's basically it's in health quality life outcomes, 2017 study. And it looked at incremental decreases in quality adjusted life years associated with higher levels of depression. Specifically it's using Medicare data, which is very good data, and that's why it's looking at older adults. So here's a study overview. It analyzed data from the CDC, so Medicare data, of a quite large amount of folks, over 3,600 adults, 65 and plus, from 2005 to 2011, and examined the association between quality and depression, quality of life and depression, measured via a highly standardized questionnaire, PHQ-9, which is used in your doctor's office. If you go to your doctor's office and your doctor is sufficiently advanced, they'll be using a questionnaire like the patient depression questionnaire, PHQ-9, to evaluate somebody's potential depression. So what will happen is that doctors right now, like the internist, family doctor, they'll ask a series of questions like, how are you feeling? And if they see that your mood has been low recently, they will whip out this questionnaire and go in depth into it. So this is a very standardized metric of depression. And here are the severity categories. So pay attention to this because it's important for the evaluation of quality, how bad somebody's depression is. None or minimal, 0 through 4. That's kind of very low depression, going from no depression to very low depression. Then mild. So going from mild at 5, going to more moderate at 9. Then moderate from 10 to 14, that's the range. And then moderate severe to severe is 15 plus. So moderate severe would start at 15 and increasingly it would get to severe, 15 plus. So this is the PHQ-9 questionnaire. Very standardized, highly reliable way of measuring depression. And so it's great to pass the Daubert standard because it's standardized, highly reliable, very much tested, used in doctors' offices across the nation. So what did the study find? It looked at the average quality of life lived from the start of the study evaluation period for each depression severity category. Non-minimal was 14 quality. So people from the start of the period to the end of the study who had no depression or minimal depression had 14 quality on average. If they had mild depression, so 5 through 9, they had 7.8 quality. So we see a nearly 50% drop in quality of life, even going to that mild to moderate range. Now, if we're going to the moderate range already, that's an even larger drop to 4.7. So we see, again, a pretty significant drop from mild to moderate depression. And moderate severe to severe, we see another pretty significant drop from 4.7 to 3.3. So we see a nearly 75% decrease in quality of life from no depression to the most severe depression. That's pretty bad. Let's just say that. Very clearly, pretty bad drop in quality of life. And that is something that you can use for a client who has become depressed as a result of a situation, and then use that in the courtroom to evaluate the compensation due to the client as a result of their depression. And we'll talk about some examples of how to do that. So significant quality loss quantifies emotional distress. So for example, if you have a major depressive disorder, which ranges from moderate to moderate severe, it's 8.3 fewer qualities, so 65% loss. So that is going to be the average of a major depression disorder. That's moderate to moderate severe. Mild depression is going to be 6.2 fewer quality, so 44% loss. Still significant loss, but not as bad. And the pattern is consistent across various demographics and comorbidities. So the key is that it's standardized. And that's the nice thing for you but you don't have to have the jury's guess whether your specific client, how depressed your specific client is. You can just show them the questionnaire. This is the questionnaire, and then that is what the study says, and this is the appropriate compensation based on here's what the research shows about somebody who has this amount of depression. The implications of the study. Every year of major depressive disorder is going to be 65% of QALY lost. And again, each QALY, year of perfect health, using the numbers that are easy to measure, 125,000, is going to be 81,000. Now, again, this is going to be higher now because the most current figures, I'm doing the City of Annapolis case, and the figures that I was citing there was 167,000 for QALY. So that's kind of in my memory. But that's just harder to do math with. So I'm going to be doing math with easier numbers, but the actual numbers are going to be something like, instead of 81,000, it's going to be closer to 120,000 for QALY lost. So for the sake of the numbers here, for ease of math, 81,000 QALYs. So if some event brings about such a disorder, the cost to the patient experiencing the disorder should be appropriately evaluated at over $80,000 per year. Other studies provide similar assessments of QALY lost for other types of mental distress and physical injuries. So for example, I was mentioning PTSD. Average QALY lost in PTSD is 34%, less so than for the QALY lost for major depressive disorder, which is 65%. So for PTSD, someone with PTSD, the QALY loss there is going to be 34%. So you do the appropriate math on that one. Other peer-reviewed studies. There's another peer-reviewed study that you can see which looks at quality-adjusted life here in older adults with depressive symptoms and chronic medical disorders. It followed older adults for 4 years. It found that depression is one of the worst medical conditions that decrease QALY, one of the worst. There are only two that rank higher and not that much higher, arthritis and heart disease. So only arthritis and heart disease are worse than depression for lowering quality of life. Okay, let's talk about QALY in relation to the PHQ-9. So remember, the PHQ-9 is the physician health questionnaire for depression. And there was a study, fortunately, that helped us with this. It said, how can we estimate QALYs based on PHQ-9 scores? So it was looking at the link between PHQ-9 questionnaire and EQ5D questionnaire. EQ5D is the most widespread used questionnaire, highly standardized for evaluating current quality of life. So obtained randomized controlled trials that administered depression screening tools, namely PHQ-9, and the EQ5D3L, which is the QALY questionnaire, one of the most common instruments used to assess it. It found that depression screening tools like the PHQ-9 accurately correspond to EQ593L. So basically, the depression screening questionnaire corresponds to the QALY screening questionnaire. It validates the use of PHQ-9 in assessing QALY lost due to depression. So peer-reviewed research supports this QALY analysis of depression. Let's talk a little bit more about QALY in legal cases. So it provides objective evidence for legal compensation. As you saw, very objectively goes through, here's the standardized situation for someone with depression, here's how much QALY they lost, and here's how much QALY is worth. So here's the amount that they're due. It demonstrates the clinical importance and statistical significance, which of course, both judges and savvy jurors want to see the statistical significance. Helps lawyers use QALY to support claims for physical injury damages, especially injury damages that are not so visible, like asthma or chronic pain, back pain, all of this sort of stuff. Emotional distress damages, which of course are not visible, and they apply anywhere from personal injury to divorce cases. objective measure of mental and emotional harm, as we saw from the prior example. So you can apply these findings to enhance your case credibility and defensibility. So again, whether you're the plaintiff or the defendant, you can apply it. And it helps you with the Daubert standard. Let's remind us of the Daubert standard. It's a legal precedent for expert witness testimony used by judges to assess how reliable and relevant expert witnesses are. So the criteria are testability. Can the theory be tested? Or peer review. Has the theory been peer reviewed? Error rates. What are the known or the potential error rates? Standards. Existing standards for the technique. And finally, acceptance. General acceptance in the academic or other expert community. So let's talk about the quality on the Daubert standard. It's very testable. It's a testable metric in health economics, quite widely used in health economics, as you saw. And I gave you some examples of the research, tons of research on this. Peer review, it's extensively reviewed in the scientific literature. Error rates, we know that there are standardized methods to minimize error rates and using various questionnaires that are standardized to each other, extensive studies on these. There are established guidelines for using QALYs to calculate things. And it's widely accepted in public health and health economics. So very widely accepted tool. Now, expert witness testimony for QALY. QALY provides clearly quantifiable health outcomes. It has a clear framework for emotional distress and physical damage, and the standardized approach ensures consistency. QALY shows rigorous scientific methods, and it simplifies complex health evaluations for the jury. All right. Are there any questions about QALY so far? If not, I'll get to the case studies. Okay. Let's talk about case study of using QALY by a plaintiff's attorney. So how can a plaintiff's attorney use QALY effectively? And so these are past case studies from client work that I've done. So one was a case study of a Jane Doe who was a victim of medical malpractice, developed major depressive disorder as a result, and we know what the major depressive disorder was. The lawsuit dragged on for 7 years. It was quite a while. I was brought in as an expert witness to assess the impact of emotional distress in the case. And this is in addition to physical damages, separately from physical damages from malpractice. So I testified to the quality impact of major depressive disorder, which you remember 65% per year reduction. And so that was over 7 years, that's 4.55 quality lost. Now, in order to cure a major depressive disorder, it usually takes about as much time as it took to develop this disorder after the cause of the disorder is addressed, which is, of course, not addressed while the lawsuit was ongoing. And so the original cause of the depression wasn't addressed, so the total quality lost was 9.1, which is 4.55 plus 4.55, which is how much presumably an average it should take to cure someone. It took as much time as to develop the disorder. So we requested a compensation for emotional distress of 1.137 million, and standard value, again, 125,000 per quality, and this was around that time. So 9.1 times 125,000 is 1.1 million. And so we asked for 1,137,500. She was eventually awarded 1.1 million by the jury, which is great. So that's on top of damages for direct physical damage for medical malpractice. So the case outcome is an example of how the comprehensive use of QALY can quantify emotional distress. And it's an objective measure that enhances credibility in legal cases. It provides a standardized and clear objective metric and strengthens the case for compensation. It provides clear defensible evidence in court and demonstrates how you can use scientific methodologies effectively for beneficial legal outcomes. Okay, That's case study one. So that's where I helped the plaintiffs. In another example, I helped the defense, where I helped the city. So there was an African American employee in the police department who sued the city for discrimination over a 2-year period. Like he experienced discrimination in the police department, racial harassment, and fair treatment. Again, there was a diagnosis of major depressive disorder, and there was medical records documenting it, which is great that there were medical records because then we can use those. And the city faced some similar cases in recent years, unfortunately. It had some issues with the discrimination. And John Doe sought 8 million in compensation. It's a lot. Previous case payouts ranged from 1 million to 5 million, so sought quite a bit more than previous case payouts. And so the city wanted a different outcome this time. It brought me in as an expert witness. And so what I did was quantify the impact using the quality metric. Now, I didn't challenge the discrimination because there wasn't really a way to challenge it. I do have expertise in discrimination and with cognitive biases, as you saw, but the situation was discriminatory and there was evidence of discrimination. So I focused on non-economic damages. So major depressive disorder, again, results in 65% of quality loss in severe cases. Over 2 years, the maximum loss is 1.3 qualities. And depression takes time to manifest. It might be lower actual loss, but let's say the maximum is 2 years, 0.65 per year, and so 1.3 qualities total. And then the recovery time is likely to equal to the time or maybe less time that you develop the disorder. So the maximum quality loss, including recovery, is 2.6 qualities. And so valued at 125,000 per quality, that's a total of 325,000. That's much, much, much less than the 8 million he was asking for. So the city ended up paying somewhat less than that, 250,000, which is great. But we convinced the jury of the reduced quality impact. And so it was even significantly less than previous settlements, than previous of payouts of 1 to 5 million. So the case outcome shows that there's quality can be used as an objective analysis for lower compensation where that's appropriate. It's a scientifically validated and quantifiable measure of distress. Its emphasis is on precise impact of discrimination, demonstrates the power of quality in legal evaluations, and sets a precedent for precise and objective assessments. Highlights the effectiveness of this scientific methodology in court. Before I talk about strategies for presenting quality in court, does anyone have any questions? All right. So let me share with you at this stage a couple of expert witness reports that I did. So this one was the one I mentioned versus the homeowners association that discriminated against the plaintiff, Chuan Chen. So I was an expert witness for the plaintiff. Talked about explicit discrimination, implicit discrimination, and examples of implicit discrimination. Talked about bias and discrimination. So again, I told you I have expertise in discrimination, but the relevant parts I want to get to is quality. Okay, so let's talk about the quality adjusted life year. So for this evaluation, we'll use a quality of 125,000. So it was back then when that was more appropriate. And so we talked about Ms. Chen's experience with the HOA's discriminatory practices over 5 years, significantly impacting her quality of life. And so, given the severe emotional distress, including chronic stress, her quality of life reduced to around 30% of quality. And so, because there was not simply chronic stress, there was not simply depression, but there was also suicidal thoughts and social withdrawal. And so, looking at the research, evaluated around 30% of quality. And so the loss per year was 70% of QALY. And so over 5 years, there's 3.5 QALY lost. And future quality of life impact is about the same, the amount of time it will take to recover. And so past QALY lost is 437,000, which is 3.5 QALYs times 125,000, so 437,000. Anticipated future QALY lost is about the same. So the total QALY lost was 875,000. And so here's detailed breakdown. So I talked about examples of stress and anxiety. So psychiatric help and was prescribed medications, provided minimal relief. And so kind of how much QALY is the justification for each impact on quality of life. Depression and emotional distress, and talked about how much loss is that. Suicidal thoughts, kind of the impact of that. Social withdrawal and isolation impacting relationships, the impact on quality of life for that in total, and the impact on job performance. And so then the total justified compensation for 875,000. So that's an example of an expert witness report on that topic. And the initial case went in our favor. They're appealing right now. So that's for the plaintiff. So when I was an expert witness for the plaintiff. Let me give an example. This is the case I'm working on right now for the city of Annapolis, where they're asking for 75,000 per person for 1,600 people. Okay. So here is the quality of life. So I talked about the background and methodology of quality of life, the research citations for it, explain. So this is a more recent case, so I'm using the 13.1 million, like the current evaluation. And that's, it wasn't 167,000 per QALY, it's 163,000 per QALY. That's 13.1 million divided by 80 years. So I talked about what are their non-economic damage claims. And they cited asthma as the sole tangible non-economic health impact. And it wasn't everyone. The complaint itself demonstrated that even among residents of mold-affected apartments, not everyone had asthma. So, for example, talked about someone who had respiratory issues, but not, her daughter had respiratory issues, but she didn't. And we saw that even the same children, where it says Miss Holiday and one of her children suffered from asthma, but not all the other children. So it's important to note that not everyone who was in a unit with mold had asthma, and not everyone was in a unit with mold. So again, that decreases the compensation that people should be asking for rather than asking for 75,000 for each person. Let's see. Okay. Then we looked at what is the actual impact of asthma, quality adjusted life impact of asthma. So research shows that asthma results in a relatively modest quality loss per year. For children, we have research, very clear research, showing that eliminating asthma in a child for 1 year would yield about 0.08 QALY gain, so about 8% in quality of life. Adults lose about 0.5 to 0.07 QALY, so that's an average of 6%. And older adults lose about 0.5 to 0.6 QALY, so an average of 0.5, an average of 5.5%. Now, here's the crux of the matter. And so here I was talking about discrimination. So they're claiming that there's a discriminatory impact from a fair housing perspective because the public housing has African Americans as 90% of the population. And so the city's policy of not inspecting public housing and inspecting private housing has a disparate impact. That's their argument. And which is not an unreasonable argument because there's obviously disparate impact if you're inspecting private housing but not public housing, if the public housing has overwhelmingly African Americans. But then you want to look at what is the actual disparate impact on the total population? Because what they're saying is that we should only look at the people who are living in public housing. What I'm arguing is that we should look at the people on the waiting list. And so there's about 1,700, over 1,700 people on the waiting list, and there's 1,600 current residents. And so if the city did try to do full-scale inspections on public housing in Annapolis, and when it found issues like mold or vermin or chipped paint or broken window screens, it told the public housing, which again, it's not funded by the city, it's funded by HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, the federal government, and it's chronically underfunded. So the city is not responsible for funding it. It's HUD that's responsible for funding it. The city only has responsibility for inspections, technically responsibility for inspections, but HUD has a responsibility for inspections, and so does the housing authority itself. And so the city does have, as part of its code, that it should do inspections. The city tried doing inspections. It found all these issues, and it said, okay, you need to fix all these issues. But then what happened is that because the housing authority in the city of Annapolis is chronically underfunded, it just didn't have the money to do the fixes. And so a number of units ended up staying empty. What they have to do is when they do a major fix, they have to move the person or the family to another unit. Or if it's temporary, they have to move them to a hotel or to another unit. So right now, the occupancy at the end of 2024 was only 82%. So only 82% occupancy. And that's because they didn't have the money to fix the units. And so that's a big problem because if they're forced to fix every little issue, every little broken window and chipped paint, well, they'll have even less occupancy. And so what does that do? That pushes people on the waiting list into homelessness. So they don't have public housing, they're forced to stay in shelters, or they're forced to stay in other places that are not really great they're forced to sleep in cars or on the streets, or other sorts of situations that are not good. So they're forced into homelessness. So basically, by doing inspections, you're pushing people into homelessness. So the question is, how bad is homelessness compared to asthma? If you're doing inspections, you're going to reduce asthma. I grant that as an expert witness. But you're also going to increase homelessness because, of course, if the unit is repaired and they don't have the money to repair it, it will stay empty. And so that will increase homelessness because people will stay in shelters because they don't have the money to fix up the units. So that's why I'm talking here about the comparative quality impact of asthma and homelessness. You can't simply look at the asthma. You have to look at what are you comparing it to. It's not an ideal situation, and the city doesn't have control over funding. So given the limited resources, you can choose asthma or you can choose homelessness. So the US study measuring the health utility of homelessness found that life in a homeless state, so someone who's homeless, was valued at only 43.4% of perfect health. So it's equivalent in quality to losing more than half a year in full health. So that's a quality loss of approximately 0.57 and 8 times greater than the quality loss from having asthma. So here's the math. Each person with asthma loses 0.07 quality per year on average. That's the upper range for adults. And the average is going to be a little bit lower, but the upper range. So let's say you have 100 people who lose 0.07 quality per year. That's 7 total qualities lost. For homelessness, if you have the same number of people experiencing homelessness, they lose 0.57 quality per year. So that's 57 total qualities lost. And again, the population is about the same. You'll have 90% African Americans on the waiting list, just like you have 90% African Americans who in the building. So the result of the city doing inspections would have been to push more African Americans into homelessness, and that's a much more bad situation. That would have been the truly disparate impact, discriminatory situation, given the limited resources, compared to the city not doing inspections and not forcing the housing authority to fix units that had relatively minor issues. So the city, what they did was inspection by complaint. When they got complaints, they inspected the apartment. They didn't do inspections every time, which is what they do for private apartments. So the asthma cost, 7 QALYs lost times 163,000 is, for 100 people, is 1.1 million in total loss, if you want to look at the total numbers lost. That's the asthma. Homelessness cost, if the city chose to actually pursue the policy of doing full-scale inspections, would have been 57 QALYs lost times 163,000, would have been 9.3 million in total lost. So that's 100 individuals experiencing asthma and another experiencing homelessness. So the disparate impact, the much worse impact, in other words, would have been to do full-scale inspections. And that's what we're arguing in the $130 million of class action lawsuit. Okay, questions about these two cases? Okay, if no questions so far, let's talk about strategies for presenting QALY in court. So you'll want to start by defining QALY and its importance. Explain how it combines quality and quantity of life, and relate QALY calculations to the specific details of each case, just like I did very clearly in the cases that I outlined, the two cases that concluded the earlier cases and the two cases that are still ongoing, where I showed you the expert witness reports. Use real-life examples to illustrate points, as I did there, what happens with 100 people who get asthma versus 100 people who are homeless. Use charts and graphs to depict QALY lost. So when I'll be presenting this in court, I will have a chart for 7 QALY lost for 100 people per year versus 7 QALY lost versus 57 QALY lost. Juries like that, makes a visual impact. That's powerful. Simplify the complex self-evaluation. Simplify medical jargon for better understanding. You need to introduce QALY, but then don't go thoroughly into things like the PHQ-9 or something like that. You need to have an expert witness who knows how to simplify complex medical jargon. Use layman's terms when possible. Present a clear step-by-step explanation of evaluations of QALY. Again, using charts, using presentations, that's very helpful. Walk through the process of how QALY is determined, like I did earlier. Highlight the most important findings. Ensure that main takeaways are clear and memorable, as I did earlier. Present QALYs as an objective and quantifiable measure. Contrast it with the typical, more subjective assessments that you see. Emphasize the standardized nature of QALYs. Show how it's consistent across different cases and contexts. Show its scientific validation. Highlight that QALY meets the Daubert standard and demonstrate the broad acceptance of QALY in health economics when you're talking to the judge. Demonstrate the scientific rigor of QALY. Reference studies and literature supporting QALY. So that is going to be especially relevant when you're talking to the judge, the expert witness report, and so on. And on the stand, the expert witness can reference QALY, or you, if you don't have an expert witness, can reference studies as a basis. Highlight the scientific validation of QALY. Explain the methodology used in calculating QALY clearly. Show how it's reliable and reproducible. Talking about the things like PHQ-9, showing the same results consistently for people over time. Expert testimony is quite helpful for explaining QALY methodology, and you want to ensure that experts who you take on can articulate the scientific basis of this tool highly effectively. Okay. And okay, I see Storm also commented that this was a brilliant way to look at the impact that I never considered when looking at discriminatory issues. I'm glad that's helpful, Storm. All right, let's talk about the benefits for you of using Quali. Use Quali for similar cases of emotional distress as I described today, or for physical injuries. So for asthma, it's a fair use. And if the city had sufficient funding and if they weren't doing inspections, then, and if there was no other group who to consider, then it would be an appropriate argument, I think, to accuse the city of, hey, your lack of inspections caused asthma, and here is the quality impact of asthma. It's not going to be 75 per thousand per person, as we saw, it's 16,000 per person per year. So we look at how many years somebody suffers from asthma as a result of mold, and we math that. But that would be a more appropriate use in that case, especially invisible harms like chronic pain or asthma, things like this. Enhanced precision in evaluations. It gives you precise evaluations, provides objectable and quantifiable metrics, so increases your defensibility in cases. It improves precision and objectivity. It's a standardized approach to quantifying distress, which reduces subjectivity in assessments and offers clear and data-driven evidence. It increases the defensibility of your claims because it's a scientifically validated tool. It meets the rigorous Daubert standard, as we talked about, and then strengthens your expert testimony. It helps you serve clients better because it ensures fairer outcomes, whether for defense, when you're defending someone or when you're a plaintiff, it ensures fairer outcomes, accurate compensation for emotional distress, and helps you build stronger and evidence-based cases. It's a scientifically validated tool that improves the strength of your case, and it gives comprehensive evaluation of mental anguish and emotional distress to support higher compensation claims where appropriate. Now, questions about this? Okay, before getting to key takeaways, I'm going to do breakout rooms for the next 10 minutes. So in the breakout rooms, what you'll see is that you'll see an opportunity to join a breakout room. So you'll click join, you'll unmute your microphone, and in the breakout room over the next, let's see, let's actually do 5 minutes. So over the next 7 minutes, you will discuss the insights from this presentation and where and how you can use it in the context of North Dakota. So in your cases. Any questions before I open up the breakout rooms? Okay, no questions. Please go ahead, click join on the breakout rooms. Okay, we're almost all back. Let's give folks a couple more seconds as they're still joining. Okay, I think everyone's back. Excellent. Hope that was a great discussion. So let's get to the key takeaways. Understanding mental anguish and emotional distress. That's really important for non-economic damages. And also, of course, understanding the quality impact, quantifiable impact of this. We talked about the challenges in subjective evaluations and why it depends on the rhetorical skill of the lawyer. Not great. We talked about the quality metric and legal evaluations and how that's a great standardized metric for you to use. Gave some real world examples, both of past cases and their outcomes and current cases that I'm involved in. Strategies for presenting quality in court. Talked about how you can do a great job of presenting quality in court, also relying on expert witnesses, and benefits for your legal practice of doing so. Now, for those who are watching the webinar after the fact, for additional resources that I'll be naming here, go to tinyurl.com/DAE event. Again, tinyurl.com/DAE event. For those who are live, I'll just send you the resources. But for those who are watching after the event, go to tinyurl.com/DAE event. And that's going to be a link to the slides, copy of my best-selling book on behavioral science, discrimination, quality, and everything like that. The blind spots between us, how to overcome unconscious cognitive bias and build better relationships, and a free coaching for integrating these strategies into your work, as well as a copy of the North Dakota Bar Journal article on which this presentation is based. And again, if you are not watching live, go to tinyurl.com/DAE event for the resources, and I'll be happy to take any questions at this stage. You can put your questions into the chat, or if you prefer, you can unmute yourself and ask the question verbally, whatever works best for you. Or if you want to just share some insights that you got from your conversation with your colleagues, that's also fine. You can unmute yourself and share any insights or pop them into the chat. Excellent, Storm. I'm very glad to hear that you found it informative. Great. Give folks 5 more seconds. Oh, okay, question. Do I see this field evolving? Now, this quality has been used since the 1960s, so it's pretty well established. The only thing that will be evolving is more fine-grained research on specific elements of quality. So, for example, we saw the quality impact of depression focusing on older adults. I'd like to see that be taken down. It's pretty comparable to adults, but I'd like to see it being taken down to children, for example. So older adults are reasonably comparable to adults, but I would like to see what the impact is of quality, what the quality impact of depression is on children, because it might be the case that it would be somewhat different. Right now, we can reasonably use that same metric as the baseline. So I think what we'll see more of is demographic expansion and more fine-grained research on quality and its impact. Other questions? And thank you for asking that, Stephanie.
I had a question.
Yes.
Do they use the same kind of concepts like in wrongful death cases involving accidental deaths where
Mhm.
they basically use this to evaluate someone's quality of life. It's a point 0.5, 0.67, whatever, and then multiply it times life expectancy for damages.
Yep, absolutely. Yep, you can use it exactly in the same way for quality of life and look at it, how long that person should have lived and what their current quality of life was, and ask for the appropriate damages based on that.
Right? Thank
Exactly.
you.
You're welcome. So Joel messaged me, asked, what are the points of dispute between plaintiff and defendant expert witnesses over which quality applies in a given situation? Yes. So, for example, I mentioned PTSD, right? So there are three different studies on PTSD that look at quality. One shows that the quality that quite reliable studies. One shows that there's a quality drop of the 34% that I mentioned. Another shows a quality drop of 38%. Another shows a quality drop of something like 26%. And so I used the mid-range study of 34%. So I used the median study. You can also argue that it would be more appropriate to take the mean of all the studies, which would be something like 29% instead of 34%. So that's an argument that can be made. And if they can persuade the jury in that direction, then obviously the compensation would be less for the person who's suffering from PTSD. So that's kind of the what I've seen as the difference in arguments. Well, if there's an effective expert on the other side. But generally, what happens at this stage, quali is not that widely used, especially in North Dakota. It's more widely used in some other states. And so what you'll tend to see when you use quali is that on one side, it's going to be just rhetoric, just kind of trying to persuade. Oh, just like in the situation with the city of Annapolis, the class action lawsuit in $130 million, they didn't use quality in their analysis. They just kind of pulled it out of the thin air. They say, well, we think every person in the building deserves 75,000. They didn't do any medical analysis. They had people had asthma and they also had vermin infestation. And so when I come back and I tell them that quality analysis shows that asthma, for the people who have asthma, and far from everyone has asthma, and far from everyone has moldy apartment, and that far from everyone who has mold in their apartment has asthma. But the people who has asthma, they claim should be something like 16,000 per year by according to the quality. And we have to look at when the person actually developed their asthma and how long they experienced it, and whether that can be linked to the mold. That's a much, much stronger counter argument. So that generally what I see is that on one side has quality, the other side just has, just number they pulled out of somewhere random, and they're trying to justify it using rhetoric. So not a standardized evaluation. Hope that was helpful, Joel. Other questions? So Stephanie asks if the PTSD that leads to major depressive disorder are both counted or just have the higher calculation. So the higher calculation would be what's counted, unless there is specific research showing that PTSD plus of the major depressive disorder causes a worse quality of life than just the major depressive disorder itself. 5 more seconds for any last questions. Okay, looks like no questions. Tony or Carrie, do you want to finish up?
Thank you so very much on behalf of SBAN. It was wonderful. We did have some technical issues today, but we will get the video sent out to everybody after so they can observe that. But we wanted to thank you so much for your presentation. It was fabulous. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Carrie. I'm so glad it was helpful. And have a great day, everyone. And you will, yes, folks will get the video. You will get the video. All right. You're very welcome. You're welcome, Andrea, and you're welcome, Terry. Sydney, you're welcome. Storm, glad it was helpful.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. You're welcome, Stephanie.